to our work across the Institute, including, of course, on climate and environment and energy themes. So with that in level of engagement, we decided it was quite appropriate to reconvene this group for a public event. And obviously with a virtual format allows for a wonderful degree of participation. A quick review of how we're going to progress in terms of the structure. We're going to keep it fairly straightforward. We have an hour and a half available to us. We'll have our main presentation of about 15 minutes, and then allow for responses. At the time of signing on, our second respondent, Rebecca Shirley, was not yet online. So we'll see when we get to that point if she's perhaps joined us and give her the word. But essentially, we want to move fairly quickly into a Q&A format. Please raise your hand virtually to indicate if you do have a question to ask. We're not going to do a question session after each presentation. We'll have the presentation, then have the responses, and then go into a Q&A session, which I will moderate. I would also ask everyone logging on to just please ensure that you keep your mic muted. I think generally etiquette around virtual meetings are broadly understood by this point. So I'll raise an issue if anything were to come up. Right, so our first presentation is by Professor Franziska Miller and Manuel Neumann. They both form part of a research group on African energy transitions based at the universities of Hamburg and Kassel. They will explain, obviously, that preceding the project that I just referred to, which we implemented last year, they'd been implementing a much larger project. But through the project that I'd referred to, they were able to then synthesize some of the key findings from that project and capture that in the briefing where I provided the link. But without carrying on too much, allow me now to hand over to Prof. Miller and to Dr. Neumann.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll just start sharing my screen. Just a second. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Also from my side, we are very happy to be here and have an intense conversation on African pathways towards just transition. We will present a few recent findings from our research and are excited to discuss them with you, Jan. Our main aim is to come up with a clearer picture of energy transition processes in the SADC region, especially regarding outstanding policies that facilitate and accelerate just transition processes. First of all, a quick recapture. Where do we stand and how are we doing vis-a-vis SDG 7 and how much time is left? Here's a sketch of the SDG progress for the SADC region with a look at two indicators: access to electric energy and money received for investment in clean energy. As it is so often the case in SADC, we get a quite mixed picture. There's many countries progressing towards broader energy access and some reaching the SDG targets easily, but still several with average access rates below 20%. And also, when we match this with finance received for clean energy, we see that amongst the countries with low access rates, only Zambia was able to tap green funds and multilateral funding by and large, whereas we see a mismatch in countries such as Angola, Madagascar, or Malawi, which means that external support for their much needed transition processes and for combating energy poverty is largely insufficient. Also, looking at the indicators for SDG 7, however, shows that their design is very much output oriented, which is, of course, feeding into the line of the broader and long-standing debate on development effectiveness. So this means that we see what has happened on the ground so far, but we have no idea just how societies got there, how successful transitions have been achieved, how shortcomings or mismatching of green funds happen, and how they could be overcome by means of better planning and better energy governance. Transition risk, which is the risk to be a latecomer and miss out on early adoption of renewable energy, is real and needs to be tackled. This is why we say policy matters. Energy policies matter a lot as they direct our attention to the political process itself. Yet Unfortunately, SDG 7 does not cover the political components themselves. And furthermore, to achieve SDG 7 means paying attention to questions of justice. It's not enough to aim at better indicators, but rather at substantial and meaningful energy transitions that reach those most in need and provide access to technology. This is why we also say justice matters. So what do we mean by pointing out this so explicitly? We refer to the concept of energy justice stemming from Black civil rights traditions, the work of Robert D. Ballard, for instance, and also liberal and deliberative justice theory, like the works of John Rawls, Nancy Fraser, and Amartya Sen. We take this as an analytical tool that allows assessing just how just transition processes are and also whether there's room for improvement. We look at three different dimensions. First, at procedural energy justice, which covers political processes and questions of participation. Then at distributive energy justice, which asks how are the benefits of renewable energy, like jobs, clean air, or access to energy distributed within society. And lastly, we're also interested in recognitional energy justice, which means are the needs of specific groups taken into account and other different vulnerabilities considered by each and every policy. So overall, we're asking how can justice be achieved by political means and how can energy policies be reformulated according to justice theory. This has been the basis for our larger research framework, for which I now hand over the word to Manuel.
Hi, everyone, also from my end, and thanks, Alex and Pippa, for organizing this event. Picking up where Franziska left off, so we basically conducted a study that was published with Politics and Governance a couple of months ago, and therein we clustered the transition endeavors of 34 African countries along the comprehensiveness of their approaches and also to what extent energy justice criteria have been met. And in this graph that you see there, I want to draw particular attention to the central column there. These countries are literally at a critical juncture within their transition endeavors, as they could, with a few tweaks in their policies and financing, drive their just transition forward more successfully. And for these very countries, it is interesting to see what the countries in the left top corner did to arrive at more comprehensive and just transition trajectories. But rather than assessing the respective policy mixes on a macro level, we picked out three very particular policy and financing examples today to just make it a bit more concrete and have more room for debate later. With these examples, we want to show how energy justice criteria can support just transition endeavors. That's kind of the overarching idea. And the examples will stem from South Africa, Zambia, and Rwanda. So what are the policy and financing innovations at hand here? Next slide, please. Let's start first with South Africa's Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Procurement Program, or REAP for short. I'm sure many people in the audience are somewhat familiar with the tender process already, but to give you some context first, South Africa has relied heavily on coal exploitation in the past, and the government basically now faces the tremendous task to decommission 35 gigawatt of its coal fleet by 2050. And in order to meet this goal, it introduced, among others, the REAP bidding scheme in 2011. And the goal was, and still is, to attract private investments into renewable energy generation. The clue, however, is that these projects are not merely allotted on best prices offered by these developers, but also include local content and socioeconomic criteria. And these are added up in a scorecard and thus tick various sustainable development boxes in the end. Currently, the fifth bidding round is open after several years of waiting, and the roadmap foresees a doubling in renewable energy generation by 2024. Now, this is kind of where our research picks up. How does REAP fare on energy justice criteria? And we have some pros and obviously also some cons. And on the recognitional dimension, we see the local content requirements which identify and benefit local industries. That's certainly a plus there. And then REAP also has a provision to ensure that project supports local communities in a 50-kilometer radius from the project sites, and the contributions so far amount to roughly 384 million rand. But we also see that more could be done to ensure that job security and energy access for geographies is ensured that lose out when coal exploitation ends. And I have Mpumalanga and Limpopo particularly in mind there. So the bidding process certainly needs refining here. And I'm not sure, but I think the GIZ made some good, or had some good ideas there. On the procedural end of our three justice dimensions, thinking, talking about participation and the like, REAP is certainly one tool to implement the integrated resource plan, which is the country's energy roadmap. And that in and of itself has several avenues for public consultation, obviously. For example, the responsibility to finalize the IRP rests with the National Economic Development and Labour Council, NETLAC. Also, and again, related to the accompanying development projects, local communities do participate in these programs. And Holle Vlockers, a colleague at Stellenbosch, for example, has done quite some research on this. And she says, among others, that certainly policy alignment could be better, for example, with a national development plan, and that the experience of people that are already active in the social and community space could be drawn upon more effectively. Now, the last third bullet on energy justice criteria in the REAP case. So on the big plus, we have the REAP clauses oblige energy companies to share revenues with local communities of up to 0.6%, and also ownership of up to 2.5%. And there's a Black economic empowerment clause in there as well. But expectations on job creation have been a lot higher so far. Some 50,000 so-called job years have been created, which is not that much if you look at it. Also, in terms of debt provision, we see the interesting trend that transnational corporates like Enel have increasingly outperformed domestic banks, with returns, or the danger looming that returns leave the country then. Fourthly, on electricity generation costs, they have significantly come down for renewables, and tariffs have generally been relatively low in global comparison in South Africa. But the renewable sector seems to be too small at this very moment to have a bearing on prices for consumers. So Eskom has recently hiked prices, for example, again. On the more critical end as well is that local industry concerns are very easily overruled. And a very interesting case in point here is the recent risk mitigation bidding scheme that was supposed to work on very similar regulation and aim to install 2,000 megawatt of electricity to avoid load shedding scenarios. And for this round, some of the local content requirements were scraped, which ultimately benefited a foreign gas power ship company, and the legal conflict of which is currently ongoing. And quite similarly in that same round, where also solar energy was tendered, the local content requirement for solar frames was also scraped, and basically for lack of availability in the country, indicating that these bidding schemes need to be more closely harmonized with industrial policy there. Okay, let's move on to the second example of rural electrification in Zambia. Briefly on the challenges. So we have heavy dependence on large hydro there, particularly on the Kariba Dam, which leaves the energy sector particularly exposed to climate change induced droughts and also rainfall shortages. Electricity access in general remains low, and that holds particularly true for rural areas. And the fiscal coffers are relatively depleted, and the means to refurbish the country's national utility, for example, are very scarce. So this is where the Beyond the Grid Fund for Zambia kicked in. The Swedish agency SIDA, that Alex referred to earlier already, provided an initial $10 million in 2016 and has another 20 million in the pipeline. Their goal is to expand energy access in rural areas. And they initially conducted a tender awarding 4 companies with the task to supply solar home systems and other clean energy appliances and services to rural areas. And these services and techniques are provided to households in return for flexible microloan payment schemes. The latest available data online suggests that the fund is very well on track to connecting 1 million people to off-grid solutions. And given their success there. The fund is currently expanding into other countries in Western and Eastern Africa, as you see on the slide. Yet, once again, the critical question for us, how do energy justice criteria further enlighten this intervention? And regarding recognition, our list is relatively short. Targeting rural consumers is key to expanding clean energy access in the country, and they certainly have a very strong point here. On the distributive justice end, however, we find that on the one hand, basic electricity access is definitely enhanced, but it is enhanced on a payback condition that some Zambians can't afford, so it's a bit selective. Also, the appliances are generally low tech, and upgrading to tier 3 of the energy ladder that they pursue is the exception rather than the rule. Knowledge transfer is also somewhat limited, and one exception being that women gain know-how through village representation. Unfortunately, further, there's only one domestic company, namely Vitalite, that is involved with the fund, demonstrating once again the somewhat missing links to industrial policies. On the procedural end, and that's kind of my last topic, the fund certainly contributes to the government's goal of providing 51% of the rural population with access to electricity by 2030. So they do feed into this general plan. But interviews that we interviewed, however, indicated that there's low engagement with civil society on the one hand, and also limited consultation with state representatives. So there's certainly room for improvement there. And with this, I hand back to Franziska for the last couple of slides.
Yeah, our third example takes us to Rwanda, whose energy policies also scored high in our analysis. And here we especially focus on Rwanda's national energy strategy, because we found that to be a very comprehensive strategy, where also distributive and recognitional justice criteria have been met. And in this case, we were especially pleased to find that the cross-cutting potential of renewable energy is recognized in many policies, and this results in more complex policy frameworks, which do, however, anticipate the typical trade-offs or shortcomings that may happen during renewable energy transitions. So in Rwanda's national energy strategy, we, for instance, found a strong focus on energy efficiency measures, a focus on cleaner production and recycling, on the integration of energy efficiency in architecture and building designs. Also, there was strong support for more energy information collection. The energy policy makes a case on coming up with good and solid energy data, which is for us as political scientists a very important thing, because very often we happen to see that that you have a very, very nice policy, but then there is a huge gap between the policy and the implementation and the evaluation itself. And for this, of course, you need good and reliable data, and this is why energy information collection is so important, to see whether a policy delivers or not. And this is something that is often left out, but we found that this here a very convincing example. Furthermore, energy education plays an important role, which again feeds very much to the recognitional dimension, because this builds a good ground for technology transfer and for improving the energy knowledge across societies. And we were also very pleased to find that the gender dimension is highlighted in Rwanda's national energy strategy. There were several sub-policies that encourage women participation in energy-related education and training, and programs and projects, and also in planning and decision-making and in energy policy implementation. Yeah, so before we hand over to the views from the African Development Bank and SAIA, some more quick takeaways. Our key message is that for successfully reaching SDG 7 and for paving the way towards the SDG's post-2030 agenda, SDG 7's goals and questions of justice need to be brought in line in a mutually supportive way. This means comprehensive energy policies may be the key for doing so, and that's why we are so much in favor of combining several tools, such as auction instruments, feed-in tariffs, green funds, or green industrial policies to arrive at a broad and effective policy mix. Also, we need to mainstream the justice dimension into energy policies. We need to ask, how does this policy contribute to energy access? How do disadvantaged groups benefit, and how can policy planning as well as the more concrete projects benefit from political participation, and also what we can do ourselves to ensure that all important civil society stakeholders become involved. Furthermore, we see the need to expand the renewable energy value production chain in the countries themselves, and this refers especially to the promotion of green industrial policies, because I mean, in the last decades, many countries have introduced local content requirements, which is of course a nice idea in order to stimulate local economies, but local content requirements themselves cannot do the job alone. They need to be integrated in a larger mindset of green industrial policy, and they need to be embedded in the larger value production chain in order to be able to deliver. Yeah, and lastly, we also see the need to tackle the policy formulation and implementation gap. And also with a view at development partners and regional organizations, we see that there's a need to develop transition scenarios based on good progress and policy frameworks. And also on that level, within development planning, there is the need to better include energy justice criteria, and also do this within SADC's energy agenda. We are very much in favor to support policy learning from best and good practice examples, and think that a kind of peer review mechanism for renewable energy policies would be a good thing in order to facilitate such learning and adoption processes. And as it has been the example in Zambia, yeah, we have a quite ambivalent view on the current de-risking measures and de-risking policies that are so much favored, for example, in Uganda, in Ghana, or in Zambia. Of course, that may be needed because investment is very important for these countries, and it's good to do something to stimulate investment. However, there's always the risk that the transition process itself becomes depoliticized and that local ownership is lost. But overall, we would still be very much in favor of carefully curated de-risking measures that are very much aware of developmental norms and of the socio-economic components that are so much embedded into any kind of energy transition process. So with that in mind, we would like to thank you for your attention. And we're very happy to discuss our views. And in case you want some more food for thought now and are very curious, here's a look at our last publications. Most of them are open access, and the one that's going to appear in Rural-AP in the next couple of weeks, we are very happy to share. Just drop them an email, and then we would also like, and we're also able to share that one. So much for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was excellent and well managed on the time front. I'm going to hand over directly to Olufonso Somoran. He's a long-time collaborator by now with SAIA, and I've asked him to respond to the main presentation in about 10 minutes. Thank you, Olufonso.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Nairobi, Kenya. And it's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation today. Thank you to Alex and the team at SAIA for extending an invitation to the bank. My name is Olufonso Somoran. I am with the regional office, the Eastern Africa regional office of the African Development Bank Group. And my work is as a regional principal officer, I lead the bank's work on mainstreaming climate change and green economy or green growth in all our operations, but also support the work around, NDC implementation in our member countries, as well as increasing access to climate and green finance. And again, thank you to Francisca Manuel for a very great presentation. And you have given us a lot of food for thought, a lot of interesting results coming out from your work. I've got personal questions, and we're going to come back to that later. I was pleasantly surprised that Kenya didn't make the list, similar to Rwanda. And I imagine somebody in the audience as well is going to pick on that, but we'll come back to that. I think there are 2 points that I really want to anchor on. The first is how, and some of the results that you've presented in the finance slide. And first is about how do we achieve effective policy mix in order to achieve just transition. And I think it's very important to deepen our knowledge on that, because on the one hand, we cannot assume Africa to be an homogeneous entity. National context, regional issues are very critical. We may have a lot to learn from what happens in some countries like South Africa, Rwanda, and Zambia. But when you come to probably Burundi, Sierra Leone, it may be different. So I think there's a contextual part of achieving effective policy mix. And we must be able to look at the policy instruments that have the potential to work in the national context. And that national context requires that we have an understanding of the historical dimension, but also the experience in policy stability and policy coherence in that country. It's very important because, first, the conversation today is about how can a just transition be supported in Africa? And if you just ponder a minute on that question, you understand the implicit assumption in that question. First and foremost, we're assuming that a just transition is possible. Because I doubt if you can support something that is not possible or that doesn't have a chance of existence. Number two, you were also making an assumption that through certain level of interventions that we may call support system, it's possible for us to entrench a just transition in an African setting. And these are very valid assumptions and underlying assumptions of it. So for me, the starting point is for us to be able to calibrate this along two main pillars. We must understand the context of what is the present day reality in Africa when it comes to energy, whether renewable or non-renewable. And second pillar is we must be able to understand as well what are the huge potential that are possible in Africa. And just to run through those two quickly, we're talking of today a continent that with 700 million people are lacking access to electricity, representing barely 40 to 50% of the population, which is the lowest in the world. That is the scale of the challenge we're talking about. We're talking of a continent today that in sub-Saharan Africa, if you remove South Africa, you're talking of per head energy consumption at 180 kilowatts per hour for an African. If you compare that to the United States, that's about 13,000 kilowatts per hour in the US and more than 6,000 in Europe. So you're talking about a huge gap, a huge disparity between the continent and the rest of the world. And we need to understand that what is this transition going to achieve? Beyond achieving a clean energy, can it expedite on a faster scale access to electricity quickly? It's very important for us to be able to have a very clear idea of the realities of today. And in some countries where people pay for electricity, it's unbelievable, and usually very poor people. The second part of that conversation is about the huge potential on the continent. We're talking today of a continent that has a potential of over 10,000 gigawatts of solar energy. We're talking of about 350 gigawatts of wind power energy potentials. We're talking of natural gas of 400 gigawatts, geothermal 15 gigawatts, and a lot of that. And you have this information. So the question then is, if you've got enormous potential, what is the challenge from harnessing that potential in order to solve the problem that you have? And I think some of the work that you're doing is trying to address that. And I think the question of effective policy mix is very important. But I also say we need to be able to understand historically what have been the barriers to policy instrument, use of different policy instruments effectively in these countries. That may be our starting point to be able to understand that transition that we're envisaging. The second point is actually quite linked to one of the recommendations that you gave. I mean, there are a number of points. I'm just going to pick two. The second point is linked to one of the recommendations you gave to development partners, and that is the work around de-risking. De-risking in order to be able to facilitate investment. And I think it's extremely important. when we use the word risk in the African context, and the audience, please correct me, you may not agree with me. There is usually the two types of risk in my own understanding. There is the perceived risk, and there is the actual risk. And most of the things that are happening, and I figure in Africa, they are often the perceived risk. And now that doesn't negate the fact that the actual risk, policy risk, implementation risk, technology risk, knowledge risk, management risk, whatever are there. But most of the time we're dealing with perceived risk in this case. So it's very important to understand what is the nature of the risk we're talking about that we need to address. And then, and that's from there helps us to go further. It's important to balance this with what the African Development Bank is doing. We like to think that the bank has been extremely supportive of renewable energy investment across the continent. Over the last few years, we've seen 90 to 95% and sometimes 100% of our annual investment across the continent are going to purely to renewable energy. And this is very important because we understand those huge potentials that are listed. But also those investments themselves, they don't have to, in some cases, the best thing they can do is to become a catalyst to unlock greater investment. And how do you do that? That is a part of de-risking. So we've been able to imagine that in some cases, if you're dealing with the government directly, the bank is able to provide partial risk guarantees or partial credit guarantees to facilitate private capital flows for renewable energy investment in the country. But in some cases as well, you're dealing for mostly on-grid investment. But if you're dealing with off-grid investment as well, we've been able to create some very specific financial products. And one of them, and I think later in the chat, I'll be able to give you a number of links, is what we call DESCO's financing program. Another one is the facility for energy inclusion. Basically, you're creating a debt facility for investors that are ready to take advantage of the huge opportunity on the market in the off-grid sector. And it's very important that this financing, they are done at something at below the market's rate, extremely competitive in order to be able to provide the safe space, let me use the word, safe space, that a number of private sectors may need for that. Now, I'd like to leave it here for now that, you know, for some of the points that have been raised, I want us to look at it, that a lot of them many of them really touch on issues of policies. But I think policies alone cannot operate in a vacuum. It has to be very much nested within a broader conversation around strategic partnership. And I always personally, and I never get tired of repeating this, that we must always look at policy partnership in a very, very unique way, particularly in the African sector. I'm going to keep you here for now. I can see Alex, I see your face. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks, excellent, excellent. And that raises some fantastic points that we can return to once we start discussions. Rebecca, I see you're signed on. I'm not sure at what point you came on, whether you've got all the presentations from the beginning. I did say that I'm not going to give long introductions. Rebecca Shirley is with the World Resources Institute with their Africa office. She also wrote a paper on that project. The link is in the chat. And I'm going to hand over her for a 10-minute response, and then we'll go into question and answer session. I see some participants have already started posting questions in the Q&A function, so we will start there. And if others want to start typing up questions there, please do so, and we'll return to those. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Alex. And yes, I was able to make most of the presentation. In fact, all of it. I came on just as Francisca was starting. I'd just like to say thank you to SAIA for having the World Resources Institute be part of this important conversation on energy transitions. And thank you, Francisca and team, for your presentation. I've actually read the paper that you're referencing from beginning to end myself, and I follow your work closely. So I'm really glad to be part of this discussion. I won't take long with my reflections. I'd like to level the conversation up just one notch before we open to Q&A from the audience, to bring another perspective and another dimension of justice to the conversation. Olufunso focused his reflections on policy, and I'd like to focus mine on governance and structural transformation. So as we all know, the global energy transition to reduce emissions from electricity and energy and the energy sector is underway. Many countries, of course, already having NDCs and emissions targets to align with the aim of limiting the rise of global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The global transition from coal power generation, which was responsible for almost 40% of emissions in 2019, is underway, as is evidenced by the success of divestment campaigns and pledges across the world. We're seeing early industrializers having largely moved to lower carbon fuel sources, while later industrializers like India and China, who do have significant committed emissions from coal, moving also to other sources. From a technological point of view, there is consensus that the most important synergy in the global energy transition is the combination of the increasing use of low-powered renewable energy technologies and a wider adoption of electricity to power end-use applications in transportation and in heat in particular. So moving towards renewables and then transitioning everything to electricity. Electrification, of course, allows for the carbon-free, allows for use of carbon-free power in place of fossil fuels in end-use applications, and significantly improves the overall efficiency of energy service provision. Now, while that all is the case, there are a number of important questions to raise in the way that we progress to this electrified and renewable system in the future regarding the structure of transformation that's taking place. For instance, just one topic to bring up very quickly that's popular right now is on electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, for instance, are more efficient than internal combustion engines. So fiscal policy is being implemented right now, especially in East Africa, to promote EV market expansion. The questions are, though, how do we ensure that this push for electric vehicles is happening in a way that is in line with sustainable visions for mobility that prioritize public transportation, paratransit, and non-motorized transportation? Or, you know, just take the 2- and 3-wheeler market. This is a huge market, especially in Eastern Africa. In Kenya alone, it's estimated to be a $14 billion market. How do we ensure that even as overseas development communities are pushing for rapid EV market expansion in East Africa, that this does not deepen dependencies on foreign products, but rather encourages and prioritizes local manufacturing, assembly, development of local industry, development of local sectors? Another consideration as we shift end uses to electricity is that this technology shift will naturally lead to the relocation of industrial processes. For instance, we're going to see a shift from traditional carbon and energy intensive steel production methods to green steel production methods with hydrogen. These shifts will have geopolitical and economic implications. They're very important. Sorry for that, just a call coming through. There are very important conversations that then need to happen about these geopolitical implications, especially for the continent, where there is an important industrialization agenda underway. Furthermore, the challenges of transitioning towards systems that are based predominantly on renewable sources range from the maturity of renewables generation and storage technologies today to the time and cost of renewables deployment at scale to goodness of fit for non-electric energy needs, as I was mentioning just now. And there's a growing debate around the role of natural gas. While outright bans on fossil fuels are a key policy positioning that's forwarded by the West, there are critical implications that we do have to consider for emerging economies that depend heavily on hydrocarbon revenues, such as the MENA region, endowed with roughly half the world's known gas reserves. And especially for vulnerable regions that are not responsible for significant emissions contributions, but are yet in the early stages of developing local energy markets that are now based on local energy resources. Or the question of cooking comes up, and what happens for those vulnerable regions where cooking access is quite low, and that see LPG as sustainable solutions for increasing access to clean cooking across countries. So finally, I just want to speak of the issue of finance and governance, because all of these challenges that I brought up are compounded by the severe lack of available finance for alternatives, lack of finance for adaptation, lack of finance for resilience building, and the questions around equity and justice in constraining or altering growth paths. So we have to investigate and interrogate the very bodies that are invested with the power to convene and define the rules of the global game, and where finance comes from. We look at the World Bank, IMF, the UNCCC. We must ask whether there is equal and fair representation of views and perspectives from the global South, and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, as it relates to what finance is needed, where, and under what conditions. In fact, there are actually many academics who suggest that the development sector's preoccupation with overseas development financing is actually diverting attention away from larger and arguably more significant issues for the global South, including the debt challenge and trade rules. So there are just complex technical, economic, sociocultural, geopolitical considerations that I would argue must sit alongside our emissions and climate projections in determining the appropriate pathways for and toward global energy transitions, in particular for the African context. While technology will certainly be a central part of the transition, I would argue that these technological advances must be coupled with some very deep thinking and critical reflection on systems and governance at a structural level to ensure that a just transition occurs. We must come to terms with these larger obstacles to development if we will achieve these emissions reductions targets in a way that is sustainable in the long term. Let me pause there, Alex. Just a couple of thoughts on governance as it relates to the just transition, and take your thoughts.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. Well, fantastic. And I'm not going to, take 10 minutes myself to also get into the view. I think we need to get the conversation going as quickly as we can. It's a bit of well, we'll see how we go in terms of moderation. I'm a little bit concerned, given all the recent developments and also the controversies around energy development in South Africa, that possibly that conversation might take over a bit. And I want to make sure that we try and keep the discussion at a broad enough and regional level. But let's keep an eye on that and see how the Q&A goes. So we've already had a few questions, and I'm going to just review I think 3 of them maybe that I could just raise. And then I also, as we get into this, Francisco or Manuel, if you could bring up that slide where you showed the dimensions of a just energy transition, because I think to many, when they hear a just transition, they see that essentially as a shorthand for green job creation, especially in the context of fossil fuel dependent countries and regions like Limpopo. But the way you framed it in your work, it's actually a much broader discussion around just transition or energy justice, shall we say more broadly. So we did have a question about the car powership deal and the recent developments in the South African energy sector. A question about, is that seen as a one-off blip in the path to a greener energy transition, or is this a sign that LNG production is going to become more central to South Africa and SADC energy production? Again, I'm going to leave that open to the respondents, whether they want to speak specifically to the South African context or perhaps talk a little bit more broadly about gas energy within this whole debate that we're having. Then I think something that we all touched on, or all the speakers touched on in different ways, particularly I think Rebecca, the question we had, how do you determine a balance between social goals and pricing? So asking for local inclusion in assembly, you're likely going to see, it's certainly generally not the least cost option. You're going to see prices going up. So how do you make those trade-offs? Because certainly there is a concern about dependency on technology, and also in the context of these big geopolitical changes that we're seeing. And we see a sensitivity within the G7, within the G20, around where technology and production capacity and value chains as relates to renewable energy lies. So, you know, the caution of Africa or African states kind of being caught in the middle or being locked into a dependency there. I think that's something we can certainly explore. There was a question just about maybe what are the top countries in terms of renewable energy IPP schemes. That might be a straightforward question for Francisca to take on if it has come out of your study. And then we had a little bit of a back and forth about the role of hydropower. And I presume the concern is generally, you know, with large scale hydropower, like we've seen Tanzania moving towards and so forth. Again, I guess all of these questions have the potential to sidetrack us quite substantially into debates that can get quite technical and all-encompassing. But let's take a stab at those first set. Let's work through our speakers, and then again, I would encourage participants to the simplest way for us is if you type the question out in either the chat function or the Q&A function. It should be fairly straightforward. Right, so I'll hand over to the speakers then.
Okay, I think I'll maybe start with commenting on a few of all the broad and similar questions that have been raised so far. I'm afraid I'm maybe not able to cover all, but then we have a larger panel, and I guess Olofunso or Manuel or Rebecca will have other issues to comment on. And I'm happy to see that we have such a broad range of questions focusing both on South African issues, but also on the broader SADC field. Yeah, regarding the car power ship issue, yeah, to me this also, I'm sure that this is a quite sensible issue in South Africa, I guess, in those days. So I'm feeling a bit uneasy to comment on that, but then, I mean, I'm doing that from my remote position. To me, that seems to be a case of hijacking a policy that was essentially meant to focus on renewable energy. And I mean, I became aware of the car power ship projects already a few years ago in Ghana. And I guess the business model is built to capitalize on load shedding and on energy poverty, especially in industrial sectors, and on energy scarcity. And of course, as a business model, this will work to have these power ships and this gas terminals. But to me, this doesn't have anything to do with renewable energy. So I do not see why this should, in fact, happen under the REAP policy. And I feel quite concerned about this issue. Yeah, and then there has been a question by Richard Worthington asking whether the justice dimension would also cover democratic governance and public ownership. And indeed, I would very much say this is part of the broader energy justice framework, and this has very much to do with the procedural dimension, because this focuses so much on participation and also on acknowledging the democratizing potential of energy transitions. That's also why I shifted to this slide again, to see how broad the understanding of energy justice is, and that in this threefold way, it's not just simply about green jobs, but it's also about participation and also about non-discrimination and also about combating forms of energy racism. So it's in effect a very broad agenda that also covers very much the social and gender dimensions of these issues. Yeah, I'm sure that Manuel maybe would love to also comment on questions of energy finance and de-risking, maybe, because we are at the moment doing quite some research on that and assessing how the de-risking agendas are moving forward. Then there has been a point on the top 10 auction auction instruments, and I think it's a bit difficult to qualify what top and what success means in that case. We have been quite, despite all criticism, we have been quite fond of the REAP because it is at least covering socioeconomic issues. Even though there are some traders, and even though there haven't been auctions happening, especially in Mpumalanga, where so many jobs from the fossil fuel industry will be lost. Still, I mean, we find many other successful auction instruments in Morocco or in Uganda or so, but I feel a bit uneasy to say they are successful just because they were able to add so much more renewable energy to the grid. Because when we look at Morocco's energy transition process, we can see that Morocco's energy policies are very much market-oriented and do not focus on the social and socio-political aspects of energy transitions at all. It's mostly left to the market, and it's mostly left to the competitive bidding process, and there's no further social component added. So this is something where I would hope for more learning from the REAP example, because there's at least this part into it. And as a last point to comment on, Rebecca, in your comment, you also focused on the upcoming hydrogen debate, which I think is a very interesting and heated issue in those days. And this is again something where I speak a bit from my German position, because in Germany at the moment we see that there's quite a large hype on producing hydrogen in African countries, particularly in West Africa and in Northern Africa. And then there's always the idea that Africa is a wide and open place for many solar panels to be built, because there's so much place, and that hydrogen could be produced very cheap and then exported to Germany or to Europe in order to green our energy mix. So that's how the model goes, and this is something I find very concerning, because very often this kind of hydrogen economy or this kind of hydrogen partnership isn't connected to developmental policy norms at all, or to socioeconomic concerns. So I'm wondering whether we can in fact find a case for a sustainable, just and fair hydrogen partnership. And so far I do not really see that this is the case, because the hydrogen debate and the energy transition debate are completely running on parallel paths. There's the hydrogen debate is very much zooming in on the geophysical potentials of the countries, whether there's enough water available and whether there's enough space for the solar panels. But it's completely decoupled from the policy frameworks in the countries themselves, and it's also completely decoupled from land conflicts or water stress or water pressure, which I find quite disturbing, because that means this kind of hydrogen partnership doesn't have to do much with a sustainable energy transition, and it's also not so much doing good to the countries themselves, for whom energy poverty is still a huge issue. So much from my side, I guess. Manu would maybe like to go on with questions of finance or de-risking, and I'm very happy to focus on any other questions, and also, of course, debate with any other panelists here.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as possible to allow for more discussion and questions. I briefly wanted to, first of all, thanks for the comments, especially Rebecca's and Olafunso's comments. I quickly wanted to get back on a couple of issues that you guys raised, and one was if the picture emerged that we were advocating for blueprint solutions, then certainly that's not the case. I guess, Olafunso, you mentioned, that the context matter, and certainly this is, I mean, that goes without saying, and we couldn't really touch on the respective contexts in depth, but certainly policies don't ever happen in a vacuum. And I think an interesting point that you made regarding differences also across countries and across continents, I feel that that's exactly where the energy justice concept has such big potentials, because there's also one element that we didn't dwell on too much today, which is restorative justice, and that also accounts for historical dependencies and also differences across countries and regions, and could certainly play a role also for just and green transitions and transformations going forward. Regarding de-risking, I think there are kind of bifurcated or very segregated debates taking place regarding de-risking, and one is the mere financial end of things, where de-risking certainly revolves around on the one hand perceived risk, but also actual risk, and how to kind of attract investors into investing their precious money into renewable alternatives. But I guess the more interesting debate for us as political scientists at the moment is to ask the question that kind of follows from that, which is rather a redistributive question as to who accounts for, like, who backstops what risk and who benefits in the end from this de-risking. And I feel, well, that's kind of one of our takeaways, and you can apply that to transition endeavors. You can apply that even to COVID-19 vaccination campaigns, that the de-risking takes place favoring investors above all else in the end, right? So if you look at you know, the billionaire at the BioNTech Pfizer firm in Germany, for example, you know, this firm invested very little money upfront, but was backstopped or financed through public institutions beforehand, but they reap the vast majority of the benefits. And that's exactly where the question of policies come in. That's exactly the questions or the concern that we raise, that it's not just about finding a potential for something and exploiting that potential through market means, but also making sure that that the distribution of fruits and burdens is somewhat equitable or somewhat developmentally geared, right? And there again, I feel the energy justice concept allows for some critical inspection. Yeah, regarding the car power ship, I do have Alex in mind, who says we shouldn't dwell too much on South African context. I mean, is it a one-off blip, Timothy, as you asked? Well, I don't know. I mean, it's they have, as far as I'm aware, there's another 3,000 megawatts in the pipeline in the next couple of years. So it's certainly part and parcel of the energy plan. And is it a future-oriented technology? Certainly, I don't think it is. But as Francisca indicated, I think it's somewhat exploiting the compromised position of the energy sector in that very instance, right? So I wouldn't want to say it's right or wrong. It's just, you know, it was an emergency situation. They, you know, decided to go for gas, and it's certainly not the cheapest option either. Yeah, social goals versus pricing. One can find arbitrary solutions, as in the REAP case, 70-30. And I guess, as always, just like with green taxonomies, for example, that's up for political discussion and deliberation. And in the end, once again, the energy justice concept can help, you know, ensure that the participatory process is more equitable than is currently the case in many instances. So maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Hi, can I jump in?
Oh, yeah, sorry, absolutely. I was going to just make sure that we continue down. So Alfonso, and then if you have further comments to follow on, Rebecca, you take it from there.
Good point. I wanted to attempt a question on whether hydropower can be considered to be renewable. And I think that I've got two answers. So there's a technical answer and there's a political answer. The technical answer is yes, it is renewable. And the political answer is it depends. And oftentimes the reason why a lot of people tend to question whether hydropower is renewable is largely because when you consider the history of some of the challenges, the consequences, oftentimes unintended consequences of many large-scale hydropower projects, and then you weigh that, on the balance of scale with the electricity that you're generating from that, and you begin to ask yourself, is this really something that we consider to be good for the environment or good for people overall? But I think the new generation of thinking with new hydropower projects across the continent, it's very keen on addressing those environmental issues. And I think we must understand that, we cannot ignore this as a resource. And if this is a major endowment in the country, this is where the best of their chances will come from when it comes to electricity generation. Then I think it's something that we have to do. But is there a way we can do it better? Absolutely. And a lot of lessons have been learned about previous hydro projects. There's another point that I wanted to talk about, and that is the policy aspect of this risking needs to, just to encourage investment capacity, particularly in manufacturing. It's not just in South Africa, but also across the continent, is to look at how, you can create that space for local partnership. In some countries, they will call something called local content. If an international investor is coming in, they expect you to partner with a local counterpart in order to be able to, make sure that certain values and interests of the local people are integrated in there. But I think to a large extent, everything comes to policy incentives in a way. And that is the strength of policy that we've been talking about. But again, if you take that forward as well, you see that we have a situation where we can look at what are the actual risks, now not perceived, what are the actual risks in this particular country, and what specific and deliberate approaches do we need to take to de-risk them? In some cases, the risks might be, should there be a change in government, and then you have a situation where you have a new administration that is not respective of existing legal documents of feed-in tariffs or whatever? How do you deal with that? And I think this is the role that a lot of multilateral development banks have been able to play to safeguard that policy continuity, even when you have new administrations in government. And one example that comes to mind is what happened in Tanzania. Obviously, it took a bit of time, but at the end of the day, people were able to come around the table. Again, I also want us to understand that sometimes when we think about private capital flows, it's not always external coming in. Sometimes there's an opportunity to think of engineering local private capital flows. And that itself may be a means of safeguarding investment and de-risking for international investors. That if you're able to have either commercial banks within the country or private investors who are willing to partner with them. And that speaks to the idea of the law of the skin in the game. And the more you have local people who are willing to put part of their own resources, or even government resources into investment, you provide the comfort as well for many international investors. So again, I want to encourage that we'll continue to deepen our knowledge about this. This is very interesting, and we can over time develop best practices that can be useful in advising other countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Rebecca, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. I think that the question that I will address is this one about determining the balance between social goals and pricing, which I think is a very fundamental question, and it's a bigger question than itself is even asking, because it's addressing the very inherent tension between relying on market-based mechanisms to achieve goals of justice and equity and access. So, just taking the example of today of renewable energy today in sub-Saharan Africa, it is a more expensive exercise, renewables here, for a number of reasons. There's the higher project costs, the operating environments, Olafunso's comment earlier on perceived risk, forex issues, there's many. And so that creates a gap. The gap is very large right now. If you look at emerging economies, generally, we're less than 20% of global clean energy investment. If you take the particular case of Congo, for instance, DRC, and you look at SC4All's estimates of electricity access investment that would be needed per annum for DRC, it's something on the order of $2 billion per year needed to deliver energy access. But of course, a country perceived as high risk, and the total that's coming through right now is something around 19 million. So a fraction per annum of what's really needed. So just wanted to highlight that question. I think it's a really important one, and it's both of the speakers have actually already addressed comments that I wanted to make, which is around the commitments to finance, number one, and then two, rethinking what even the challenge of de-risking finance. That's actually a much deeper question, and Manuel was getting at some of that, of who bears the cost of de-risking and who benefits from de-risking. And so I think it's just a really, these are very complex topics that I think even as we're developing policy deserve more fundamental, almost critical theory responses and evaluation. Thanks.
Fantastic, here we go. I see there haven't been much more questions raised in in the chat. I wonder, Elena, if you are still logged into the event. You raised a question about Rwanda, but I'm not sure I follow exactly as it was written there. I don't know if you want to maybe unmute yourself and take a stab at raising that question. Well, we'll work with what we've got here in the text. Insightful discussions about, and I'm not sure if this was a spelling mistake or a neologism here, but dramatic political rulership. Is that supposed to be leadership in Rwanda? Steady electrification rates. Can you please comment on the political versus the economic disjunction? So again, as I said, maybe that's not too clear, but if that maybe sparks a thought with our speakers, we can certainly return to that. There was also a question I think we've delved over, but if framing it in this way sparks some new thinking, what policy aspects de-risking needs to take place to encourage building of manufacturing capacity in Africa. And then I guess something that's I think triggered in my own thoughts around the financing issue that we've been talking about, and some of the recent things that have been happening in South Africa, is that when we look at even now the recent announcement of own generation suddenly going up from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts, and the ongoing discussion and regulatory changes around allowing municipalities and metros to essentially make their own energy generation deals. It seems, and this is maybe just a superficial remark, but it seems that it's not so much about finance through a fund of any sort coming through. It's much more a case of just putting the regulatory certainty and systems in place that then releases the private sector funding. And I guess that kind of raises a question about our discussions around climate finance and the scale of climate finance needs. I realize this is a very kind of superficial framing of it, but it seems that certainly one of the insights coming from South Africa is that there's a discussion to be had about if the regulatory environment and the kind of political economy agreement isn't where it needs to be, then no amount of climate finance is going to fix that. All right, so we've had some comments, and it's a little bit loose, but I think I'm just going to kind of hand the microphone back, so to speak. Maybe we'll take the approach Alfonso has taken here for the other speakers as well. Just raise a hand if you want to comment in the second round. Alfonso, I'll go to you first. Other speakers, you're welcome to raise a hand.
Well, thank you, Alex. I mean, I think there's a point that just come to mind. just something a bit different from what you've just said. It's quite convenient to look at the approaches in many countries at a national level. What is South Africa doing? What is Rwanda doing? What is Kenya doing? But we may be missing out on opportunities at the regional level, especially given the fact that regional, there's a bit of a regional identity. And in most parts of Africa, you've got existing institutions that are structured at regional level. Either power pool agreement or, a form of free trade mobility in a way. Because I'm beginning to see that, your just transition strategy at national level may actually involve partnering with your neighboring country. If Ethiopia can produce electricity way cheaper than, let's say Tanzania or South Sudan, your investment strategy may be more towards a connection line, transmission lines, as opposed to investing on expensive, generation within your own country. And so we may want to just expand it as well to say, what are the identities or existing institutional frameworks at regional level that we may take advantage of to think of just transition beyond national borders, beyond national context, but also to take advantage of regional identities and regional opportunities. I just wanted to put that there and just for us to reflect on. Thank you.
Thanks, and apologies for my typing. I should have muted while you were speaking. Francisca, Manuel, Rebecca, any thoughts on where we're at now? Manuel?
Yeah, please go ahead, Manuel, if you like.
Okay. Yeah, I can certainly second Olufunso there on the national frame not being the only proper frame to look at there, and rather than taking the bigger regional frame and looking at that more closely, I'd rather comment on what Alex said earlier on the municipalities level, and you kind of mentioned regulatory bottlenecks as kind of the key impediment to private sector finally being able to release rather than be attracted to funding. And I feel, at least in the South African case as I read it, the questions of regulations are always linked to political questions of interest groups once again, right? And there was a long, let's say, bottleneck regarding making municipalities able via regulation to be able to produce their own electricity, because it would make them independent of Eskom. And since Eskom's business model largely depends on also reaping the benefits of selling electricity to the municipalities, of course, these are transformations that don't go uncontested. But I think that debate is somewhat cold coffee. I guess the more interesting question now is with it being possible, who stands to benefit in the end? And I feel, in my reading, once again, is that especially those municipalities stand to benefit that already acquire or have already acquired very decent, let's say, very good market standing, so to say. So, the city of Johannesburg, for example, or Cape Town will very readily be able to attract private investors because they have a solid, asset sheet, basically. And there will be other municipalities that are severely indebted, and that's a big problem, and they will not be able to raise the private investments needed, right? So once again, it's a question of how do you balance market potential or market interests with questions of equitability and development. Maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, it takes us back to the distributive justice aspects of the framework. Francisca?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more on the points that Manuel has already made, but we haven't disclosed that Manuel is an expert on green bonds and is very much wondering what green bonds may mean in terms of a more sustainable investment practice and if they are able to deliver or not. There's one question from the Q&A that I would love to focus again. regarding what de-risking could mean within manufacturing capacity in Africa, and what policy aspects or what kind of de-risking needs to take place to encourage building of manufacturing capacity. I think that's an important point, because it carries us much more forward to the question what risk actually means, and also what risk perceptions mean, and how they are created, and how they are constructed, and how they can be deconstructed again. And I mean, being a social scientist, for me, it's quite important to not just qualify risks in terms of cost of money and investment, but of course, risks have always a very long history in perceptions. There's Orientalism and Occidentalism. There are, of course, many views by Western investors that would consider Africa as the risky continent at all. And so I think de-risking as such is not something innocent. It needs to be also understood in that larger context. But still, focusing on the value chain and focusing on, making the renewable energy value chain longer in African countries, I'd always say it has a lot to do with risk perceptions that zoom in on employability of local personnel, and on educational capacities, and also on technology transfer. So I think these are the kind of risks that need to be taken into account, and these are the kind of risks that the state could focus on, for instance, by offering training facilities, by offering on-the-job training, or by supporting small and medium enterprises from the global north in overcoming these kind of perceived risks. This could be maybe something to add on that.
Thanks for that.
Alex, yes, please. I'll provide some thoughts on, I think it's an interesting conversation that we're having at this sort of challenges at the local level in terms of municipalities and so on, and then the regional thoughts that Olufunso brought. Just let me make a one quick comment on that, whether regulation is sort of the key bottleneck at the local level. I think that sounds like a sound argument, but actually when you look at individual case studies, you often find sometimes the opposite is the case, and that we have sometimes over-regulated environments. I'm just going to make an example of here in Kenya, and the space that I know, which is the solar space here. You have a situation where, with the draft regulations that were recently announced, these are largely seen as adding more permitting rules to the solar space. So there's also now a new tax rebate of about 20% on electricity costs, which is reducing the cost savings of self-generation relative to KPLC. There's a net metering program that was scheduled to be brought on board. It has a very low cap. There's a feed-in tariff, but again, the process is very cumbersome. There are all of these licenses, and with each license means new fees and new taxes. And now there are licenses that you have to get for every county that you want to operate in. So it actually creates sometimes a very difficult and almost hostile operating environment, especially for startup companies, for local startups, even for those that are not in the startup space. So I think it's important to also recognize that there is, even as we talk about regulation itself is inherently political. Everything is political, and so we have to really be thoughtful and take a nuanced look at again the actors, the constellation of actors, who's benefiting from what types of regulations, and what we sort of have to follow the thread of the narrative to its complete end. On the regional scale, I think that's a really important point that Olufunso brought up. And I think the power pooling idea is very, very compelling. There's a number of benefits in theory: better connections between supply and demand, more optimal use of and cost of generation, improved reliability, economies of scale, and economies of scale for attracting investment as well. And in fact, the South African power pool, the East African power pool, the West African power pool are all established and have been operational for the past 20 years. But there are very big challenges to get power pooling to work well. Just technically is the real challenge of weak transmission and interconnection infrastructure. But moreover are, again, these challenges that I keep coming back to of governance, challenges of politics and sovereignty. There are actually many new transmission lines that are planned, but are held up because of the politics and sovereignty issues. Also here in Eastern Africa, most of our utilities are monopolies, and for monopoly structure, it's not always in their interest to have competition that would become available, and power pooling would lead to competition. So we have a situation where essentially there's not enough supply or buyers to be competitive without the risk of arbitrage. So again, I just want to keep my theme for this panel is governance. I keep coming back to that, both at the regional level and at the local level. And if we're not solving those issues, then we're going to keep running into these types of roadblocks along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a small kind of side conversation around regulation and kind of what are we hinting at in that conversation. And my sense certainly is, and maybe picking up on your comments as well, that it's not a kind of ideological stance pro or anti-regulation. It is about the right kind of regulation that addresses those incentive structures, that is, and as we've all been saying, we recognize that as social scientists and bringing a kind of a political economy perspective to this issue, understanding the contestation, the power structures, the dynamics that play out, which we see this playing out in all the countries that we've been speaking here. This is the level at which the analysis really has to be made, and where the kind of regional work and these kind of frameworks that we have presented by Francisca and Manuel can be useful to bring in those regional insights and to establish those core criteria and give us a framework within which to do our analysis. But then within that framework, you drill down into the local, national politics and the political economy understanding of the dynamics as they play out. So we're into our final minutes. If there is a final word from our speakers, let me give that opportunity now. Any final comments? I see Manuel hands is up. Let's just do a run through. If one of the speakers says no comment, then we'll just skip. Let's start with Manuel and we'll just do a run through.
It's not even really a last comment thing. I just saw the last question in the Q&A, and it asked about the bang for the buck investing in South Africa rather than the UK, and why does it not match? And I guess a brief anecdote there relates to, sorry for the bias, but the German companies operating in South Africa before the REAP kicked in, and they essentially left the country when REAP was announced, fearing too much competition, right? And they kind of judged the situation wrong, because in the end, most of the programs that were already running were then kind of collected under the REAP program. So the remaining competitors all kind of stayed in the country. So it's once again a question of assessing the risk right for the companies. And as I briefly dwelled on in my presentation, the current issue is that the big multinational corporations have realized how easy it is to invest in so profitable destinations such as the REAP program in South Africa, because they can easily fund it through their balance sheets. And so there is a certain dynamic of transnationals like Enel driving out domestic financing that goes through Nedbank, for example, or other domestic banks. And that's once again a new dynamic that needs to be taken into account as well. So it's not really a last word, but just a comment on the question.
Not a problem, but let's run through. Francisca, Alfonso, Rebecca, we'll see how we go, and then I think it'll be time to wrap up.
Yeah, also a quick comment, and thank you from my side for all the very fruitful and very professional comments. I was very happy to see that during our conversation, Rebecca constantly reminded us of that what we're talking about are mostly questions of energy governance, because that also feeds very much into the points that we wanted to make, especially when we look at many countries that are in these essential quadrant, and which are at the moment deciding whether they focus more on a market-based energy transition or more on a state-based energy transition. And it's of course a very interesting question to see how these decisions will be made and what kind of policy mix we will see happening in Zambia or Malawi or Namibia or any other countries in SADC. And when we talk about energy projects, I think it's also important to always be aware that energy projects are embedded into social systems. They always speak back to the social cultural context in which they are developed, so they don't fall from the sky, which is sometimes thought when we think of northern investors coming to the global south. But rather, it's always a question of how our technology can be embedded into a society, and this is also something where social science is a very important thing. And this is also why we say the policy mixes matter so much. Which combination works best for which country, and how can energy policy norms and social and development aspects always be brought in line with each other. And that's why the whole thing is in fact so complex, but that's also why countries have to choose very carefully what their personal and individual just transition pathway will be. I mean, we will keep witnessing these processes, and we are always very happy to comment further on that.
All right, good point. Thank you. This has been a very fruitful discussion. I'm reminded again the question of today: how can a just transition be supported? So again, a just transition is already happening in Africa, and there's an opportunity to scale it up at a rate that makes it that speaks to the challenges of the day, because the problems are also growing. I like to say this, and I may sound a bit controversial. When it comes to resources that we need to scale up investment in renewable energy, I think we have enough money in the global economy as it is today. The challenge is distribution. I think we do have enough money in the global economy, trillions, trillions and trillions of dollars. We have not enough. I mean, International Energy Agency says we need $120 billion yearly for the next 20 years. And that is not something that we cannot afford. And I think that speaks to the need to begin to question, the global commitment, but also the regional, in this case, African commitment towards scaling up the investment. I think we also know what needs to be done. It's not rocket science, but we need to get it done. So thank you very much. It's been a great privilege being part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yes, I completely agree with Olufunso. There is no doubt more than enough financing available and money in the global economy. It's a distribution challenge. Even just here on the continent, we're losing $1 trillion every year in outflows to the global north through illicit tax havens. If that was recouped, what would that mean for the continent? So really, these distribution challenges, these governance challenges I think they're so fundamental. And I loved your point, Alex, about the power structures and this being the level of analysis at the regional, at the local level that's really needed to help solve some of these challenges. And I think that that's absolutely right. I think that we need to see more local scholarship, more local perspective being brought and raised up to the level that you're doing with this webinar of the global dialogue, so that we have local social science, finance, technology, governance thinking being sort of pulled out and distilled into actionable insights and lessons. So I just to say thank you for having me be part of this conversation. And on that note of local scholarship, I'll actually just paste a link into the chat of a special issue that's going to be running, that is already running on energy transitions and sustainable transformations in Africa. I get the sense that in the audience there are quite some number of scholars themselves in here. So I'm just posting that for those that might be interested as well. Thanks, Alex.
Excellent. And well, we've all been thanking, saying thanks to each other, but certainly from me, a very sincere thank you also to our speakers first and foremost, and certainly to everyone who participated. It's dwindled off a little bit as we go into the closing sessions. We were at one point 100 participants, so I think that level of engagement is really indicative of the level of interest in this conversation. There was just a final question about whether the recording is available for download anywhere. I might just need to refer to Sarasa or one of our events team if they're listening in.
Sure. The recording and the presentations, if you share them with us, will be uploaded to our website, and we will send out the post-evaluation email to everybody with the copy to the recording.
Very good, very good. Well, then all that's left for me to say is thank you again for the participation. A lot of the material that we've discussed today, links have been provided. Please engage with that. Our institute, everything we produce as an institute is available for free download off our website. I encourage you to engage with that material, and you can also access our contact details through the website. So thank you very much, and signing off.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.